cringe lab where we laugh.
Ready to dive into some seriously trippy ideas about reality? We're going deep on this one, folks, exploring this whole consciousness thing and how we see the world, all through the lens of James True's The All-Seeing Eye. You familiar with his work?
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a wild ride, I'll give him that. Some might even call it out there. But there's something undeniably fascinating about the way True unpacks these big questions about how our brains construct reality.
Exactly. And full disclosure, he's got some pretty unconventional theories, to say the least. We're not here to tell anyone what to believe, but I guarantee you'll come away from this deep dive looking at the world a little differently. So True kind of kicks things off with this idea that our conscious minds, the us we think we are, might not be as in control as we like to believe.
Right. Like, think about it, breathing, your heart beating, digestion,
Yeah.
all these essential bodily functions just happen without us having to consciously think about them.
It's like our bodies are running on autopilot most of the time, and we're just along for the ride.
And it kind of makes you wonder what else is going on beneath the surface,
All right.
right? Like that classic analogy of the iceberg. What we're consciously aware of is just the tip, with this massive, mysterious realm of the unconscious lurking beneath.
And maybe, just maybe, that unconscious realm is shaping our perception of reality in ways we haven't even begun to grasp, which is where the pineal gland comes in.
Ah, yes, the pineal gland.
True goes deep on this one, claiming it's way more than just a melatonin factory.
Which is what we usually hear about, right?
Exactly. Like, he talks about how it can track all these different time cycles, from our daily rhythms to the changing seasons, even puberty, all without relying on external cues like sunlight.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. And it's not just True either. The pineal gland has captivated cultures for centuries. The ancient Egyptians, they called it the Eye of Ra. And throughout history, you see this concept of the third eye, this gateway to higher consciousness, often linked to the pineal gland.
And this is where it gets even weirder. True introduces this whole concept of physioelectricity, the idea that the pineal gland can sense subtle electromagnetic frequencies. He even goes so far as to call it our first eye, suggesting it might be picking up on a layer of reality that our physical eyes can't see.
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder if those ancient traditions, through observation and intuition, might have been onto something about this little gland's connection to a larger, unseen reality.
Okay, but how does this relate to our everyday experience? That's where True's idea of aperture consciousness comes in. Imagine the lens of a camera, right?
Okay, I'm with you.
A wider aperture, it lets in more light, but the image might be a little fuzzy. A narrower aperture, you get a sharper focus, but on a smaller area.
So you're saying our consciousness, how we perceive things, is like that camera lens,
Yeah,
constantly adjusting, focusing, and refocusing.
exactly. And True's suggesting that our aperture consciousness is always shifting, depending on all sorts of factors. Past experiences, traumas, even our cultural conditioning.
So like someone who's grown up in a chaotic environment might have a narrower aperture, filtering out a lot of sensory input to avoid feeling overwhelmed.
And on the flip side, someone who feels safe and secure might have a wider aperture, allowing them to take in more of the world around them.
But then the question becomes, what controls that aperture? How do we adjust it? Or is it all just happening automatically?
Well, True points to the vagus nerve, specifically the polyvagal system, which plays a huge role in regulating our emotions and how we respond to stress.
Okay, that makes sense. When we feel safe and connected, our aperture might widen, allowing for more curiosity and openness.
Right. But under stress, that aperture narrows, creating a kind of tunnel vision as we shift into survival mode.
Like when you're giving a big presentation and you suddenly blank on everything you were going to say, your focus narrows to that one overwhelming feeling of anxiety.
Exactly. Or think about those times when you're hyper-focused on a task, like you're in the flow state or you're feeling super creative. Maybe that's your aperture widening, allowing more information and inspiration to come flooding in.
It's a fascinating way to think about it. So if the vagus nerve is involved, does that mean we can consciously control our aperture settings? Or at least influence them?
Well, that's where True's theory takes an even wilder turn. He suggests that dopamine and melanin, those naturally occurring chemicals in our brains, might actually be the key players in regulating this whole aperture consciousness thing.
Okay, now we're getting to the really interesting stuff. Dopamine and melanin, huh?
He calls dopamine the gas pedal and melanin the brake pedal of our perception.
I kind of love that analogy. So dopamine ramps up the sensory input, makes us more alert, more receptive.
Exactly. And then melanin comes in and kind of says, whoa, slow down there, buddy. Let's not get too overwhelmed. It dampens things down, prevents us from getting overloaded.
So it's like our brains are constantly trying to find that sweet spot between experiencing the fullness of reality and protecting ourselves from sensory overload.
Precisely.
That's amazing. And it would make sense, right? Like some people thrive in really stimulating environments while others find them totally overwhelming.
Right. And maybe it all comes down to this delicate dance between dopamine and melanin, how our brains are wired to regulate that aperture, so to speak.
Which begs the question, if dopamine and melanin are involved, does that mean we can hack our own perception? Now, that's a question worth exploring and one we'll dive into deeper as we continue to unravel the mysteries of James True's fascinating, if unconventional, theories. Stay tuned. So we're talking about how our brains might be filtering reality, kind of like constantly adjusting our aperture to manage how much we experience, But what about those times when it's like the filters just completely disappear?
Ah, see, that's where True's ideas about hallucinations get really interesting. He suggests that maybe they're not actually malfunctions at all.
Oh.
Yeah, instead, he thinks they might be these little glimpses into other layers of reality, like frequencies that our brains, for whatever reason, usually block out.
Interesting. So it's like our brains are normally tuned to a specific frequency, right? Like we're picking up on a certain channel.
Yeah.
But there are all these other channels out there, these other frequencies that we're just not tuned into. Exactly. He even uses this analogy of like two people, both under the influence of meth, describing the exact same shadow figure and not just seeing it. They're actually having a conversation with it. It's like they both tapped into something outside the realm of what we typically consider normal perception,
So it's like they've both stumbled onto the same radio frequency, even though most people aren't even aware that frequency exists.
It makes you wonder if what we call reality is really just like a consensus agreement.
Right, like this consensus reality, what we've all collectively agreed is real.
Exactly. But who's to say that's the only reality out there?
Yeah.
Maybe there are countless realities coexisting with ours, just waiting for us to expand our perception and tune in. And True doesn't shy away from connecting these ideas to shamanism. He points out that in many cultures, these individuals who can access those altered states, those other frequencies, are actually revered. They're seen as like these conduits to knowledge and wisdom.
It's such a stark contrast to how a lot of Western cultures view those same altered states.
Right. We often see them as something to be afraid of, to medicate, to dismiss as crazy or unreal. But maybe some cultures have just held on to those keys, the ones that unlock the doors to these other realities, while other cultures have chosen to lock those doors and throw away the keys.
It's like we've lost the instruction manual for our own consciousness.
And that's another thing that True talks about albinism. He suggests that in some shamanic traditions, albinos are believed to have a naturally wider aperture.
Really?
Yeah. They might be able to perceive things that others can't because they lack melanin.
Which we were saying is like the brake pedal on our perception.
Exactly. So without that melanin, maybe their apertures are naturally wider, allowing them to tap into those other frequencies more easily. It's a fascinating idea, right? And it really gets to the heart of how we define what's normal and what's not. If everyone's reality is shaped by these unique aperture settings, then normal becomes a very fluid concept, doesn't it?
It definitely makes you think twice about those labels we put on mental health experiences. Like, what if some of the people we label as schizophrenic are simply experiencing a wider spectrum of reality than what's considered normal?
It's a really sensitive topic, but it's one that True doesn't shy away from. He even goes into some interpretations of biblical stories.
Oh, wow. Like what?
He talks about how figures like Noah and Jacob, they might have been albinos. And because of that, they might have been gifted with this wider aperture, which allowed them to perceive the divine in ways that others couldn't.
Whether you subscribe to those interpretations or not, it's really interesting to think about how these ideas of expanded consciousness and alternate realities have been explored throughout history. Like cultures all over the world across different time periods have grappled with these same questions about the nature of reality and what it means to perceive beyond our ordinary senses.
It really circles back to True's central argument. This tiny little gland, the pineal gland, might be far more important than we give it credit for.
Right.
Like, what if it really is the key to unlocking this whole other level of perception, this richer, more nuanced experience of reality?
It's almost like we've been given the keys to the kingdom, but we've forgotten how to use them. Or maybe we're just afraid of what we might find if we do.
True even talks about the possibility of using technology to enhance our perception, like imagine an injection that could temporarily block melanin production in the eye.
Whoa.
Yeah, and then we could like literally see beyond the limitations of our normal aperture.
It's giving, like, limitless, but in real life.
Right. But the more we discover about the brain, the more we realize just how much we don't know, you know?
It's both exhilarating and, honestly, a little terrifying at the same time.
Absolutely. Like, on the one hand, imagine the possibilities, the worlds of experience that might open up to us if we could just figure out how to control our own aperture settings.
Right.
But then there's the other side of that coin, the ethical questions.
Oh, absolutely.
If we can control our perception, how do we ensure we're using that power responsibly? How do we prevent it from being used to manipulate or exploit others? Those are some seriously heavy questions.
For sure. But for now, I think the most important thing is that we're asking those questions, that we're staying curious.
Right. And that we remember our understanding of reality. It's not static. It's always evolving. There's always more to learn, more to experience, more to explore.
You know, it's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it. We could all be walking around with these totally different versions of reality playing out in our heads, right? Each of us shaped by our own unique aperture settings, like True says.
It really makes you think about the whole idea of empathy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like if we're all operating with these different filters, these different ways of seeing and experiencing the world, well, no wonder we sometimes have trouble understanding each other.
That's a really good point. What might seem totally obvious to me could be perceived in a completely different way by someone else, just based on their own unique aperture, right?
Exactly. It kind of highlights how important it is to approach every interaction, every conversation with a certain amount of, I don't know, humility, maybe, an openness to the idea that our way of seeing things isn't the only way.
Oh, absolutely. Because you never really know what filters someone else might be looking through, what they might be picking up on that you're completely missing.
It's all about curiosity, you know, asking questions, being willing to listen to perspectives that might challenge our own. Because the more we can understand about how differently we all experience the world, the richer and more nuanced our own understanding of reality becomes.
So where does that leave us? I mean, if our perception of reality is so fluid, so open to interpretation, then how do we even begin to answer that age-old question? What is real?
Maybe the better question is, what is my reality? And how does my reality compare to the realities of those around me?
Yeah. And even more importantly, what am I missing? If we're really only tuned into this tiny sliver of a much broader spectrum of experience, what possibilities might open up if we could just figure out how to expand our awareness?
That's a question that artists and musicians, spiritual seekers, they've been exploring those questions for centuries. Think about the different ways people have tried to tap into those altered states of consciousness. Through meditation, through music and art, even through things like shamanic rituals, right? They're all trying to push the boundaries of perception, to experience reality in a different way, and then to share those experiences with the world.
It's like they're showing us these glimpses of other realities, these other frequencies that we might not be able to access on our own.
And it really makes you wonder what the human mind is truly capable of. We might not all have access to those more, shall we say, unconventional methods of expanding our awareness.
Yeah.
But there are other ways to cultivate a more expansive view. Mindfulness practices, spending time in nature, really anything that helps us quiet the noise of our everyday lives and tune into something bigger than ourselves.
It's about approaching life with a sense of wonder and curiosity, I think. A willingness to let go of our assumptions and embrace the mystery of it all.
Beautifully said.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the absolutely mind-bending world of perception and consciousness, I think the biggest takeaway here is that we're all on a journey of discovery, right?
Yeah.
Our understanding of reality is constantly evolving. There's always more to learn, more to experience, more to explore. And maybe, just maybe, the true nature of reality is far stranger and more wonderful than we could ever imagine. Thanks for joining us for this incredible exploration. Keep those minds open, friends, and we'll see you next time.